Most of the American politicians, media, and educational system trains another generation of people who think they are living at a peacetime. False. The United States is in the state of war, undeclared total war against the basic principles and the foundations of this system. However ridiculous it may sound, the world communist system or the world communist conspiracy, whether I scare some people or not, I don't give a hoot. If you are not scared by now, nothing can scare you. But you don't have to be paranoid about it. What actually happens now, that unlike myself, you have literally several years to live on unless the United States wake up. The time bomb is ticking. With every second, the disaster is coming closer and closer. Unlike myself, you will have nowhere to defect to. You don't have much time, especially if you are talking about young generation. There's not much time left. Very soon it will go, just overnight. It's simplistic. I know it sounds unpleasant. I know Americans don't like to listen to things which are unpleasant. I have come to talk about survival. It's a question of survival of this system. You may ask me, what is it in for me? Survival, obviously, because as I said, I am now in your boat.
Many times I wonder, am I dreaming? Am I back in Romania? It's impossible. It's not America. The American people have experience of socialists in Russia, in Romania, in Venezuela, in Cuba, in China, in many. So historically, they have more exposure than my own parents have. So they have to learn that that is a lie that will destroy your freedom.
The worst times came, the times of brainwashing. Who has not passed through brainwashing can't understand what torture it is. From 5 in the morning until 10 in the evening, 17 hours a day, we had to sit just like this. We were not allowed to lean. For nothing in the world could we rest a little bit our head. To close your eyes was a crime. 17 hours a day you had to sit like this and hear. Communism is good, communism is good, communism is good, communism is good, communism is good. Christianity is stupid, Christianity is stupid, Christianity is stupid. Nobody more believes in Christ, nobody more believes in Christ. Give up, give up, give up. These days, weeks, years, we had to listen to these things.
I remember vividly all the promises that a guy named Castro gave on how 99% of the people swallow the pill. It took many years later, after I read somebody named Saul Alinsky, that I realized that all those people were nothing but useful idiots. I remember all the promises that we hear today about free education and free health care. And I was on my way to Spain. I wasn't even coming here because I was going to join my brother, who my parents had already sent a few months before, because he was in the age where the government will take him for indoctrination purposes. Never forget about my dad, who only had a 6th grade education, but I think he was the greatest philosopher I ever met. He used to tell us how lucky he was because he was able to come from Spain to Cuba. And then he came from Cuba to the United States. And he saw me graduate from college. And that was the biggest prize he ever had. And he said, don't lose this place because you're not going to be as lucky as me. Because if you lose this place, you have no place to go. So with that, please keep that in mind. And please, people, explain that to our young people who are demonstrating out there. Don't be useful idiots. Please understand what's happening in our country. See what happens to our parents. And see what is happening to America today.
Since 1990, I've been researching the topic of brainwashing. Whether you call it propaganda, information operation, psychological warfare, behavior modification, active measures, character assassination, command and control warfare, historical revisionism, political warfare, or disinformation. The goals are the same: the complete and total control of an individual, a group, society, and culture through the transformation of the values, beliefs, and ideas of the target of the brainwashing operation. Once their values have been compromised, rejected, and replaced with the values of the power elite overseeing the brainwashing warfare, their worldview, upon which their values were built, is replaced with a new foundation. Once the values of an individual or group have been replaced, their conduct or behavior is transformed. Brainwashing is about power and control. Brainwashing relies upon lies, deception, manipulation, bullying, shaming, the destruction of individualism, the promotion of group consensus, an attack on people of conviction and courage, and the creation of chaos to induce fear and then surrender. Every American has been subjected to the techniques of brainwashing, whether they know it or not. In fact, a vast majority of Americans, for several generations, have been successfully brainwashed to one degree or another. The question is, have you been brainwashed? And if so, to what extent? If you have been brainwashed, how do you undo the damage? Do you know the techniques that are used every day in every area of life to facilitate brainwashing? How can you rescue your family, friends, and fellow citizens from the psychological warfare of the elite and change agents? What are the most powerful weapons for destroying the success of any brainwashing operation? Today, the lies of brainwashing hide under many well-known masking terms, such as social justice, the common good, white privilege, racism, multiculturalism, climate change, interfaith dialogue, political correctness, feminism, tolerance, globalism, deconstructionism, anti-authoritarianism, the peace movement, environmental justice, the right to die, universal health care, sustainable development, global values, situational ethics, children's rights, family planning, reparations, gender equality, group consensus, community standards, a livable wage, and democracy. These are just a few of the masking terms that hide the agenda of socialism, cultural Marxism, and the endgame goal of globalism. Through this docu-movie, we will expose and refute the brainwashing propagated by the power centers, their change agents, and the useful idiots within education, media, religion, and government. The success of the decades of brainwashing can be clearly seen through the destructive nature of the values, beliefs, and actions of many Americans.
We're going to have to blow up the entire system.
So we have to stop demonizing people and realize the biggest terror threat in this country is white men, most of them radicalized right to the right.
Our country should be more fearful of white men across our country because they are actually causing most of the deaths within this country.
You didn't say anything to anybody? You were just walking out or what?
I was walking out with a Trump sign. He grabbed my Trump sign and started following me, saying I was like a racist and
So in this particular study, it showed that if you were more inclined to free market capitalism, you had a higher tendency of holding ethnocentric values. For me, capitalism is like the all-consuming thing. Capitalism maintains white supremacy, white privilege, racism, sexism, patriarchy, heteronormativity, you name it, capitalism.
I think that for too long, we have lived in a society that has poured resources, too many resources, into a policing system that creates an unsafe situation, especially in Black communities. And I think that we need to be more creative than that. We need to completely reimagine and redefine what public safety is. And no one at Black Lives Matter is responsible for the things that your guest is talking about. There had been no call. There's never been a call for us to.
Now, pigs in a
there
blanket,
has been
fry
no
'em like
call.
bacon.
Do you hear what he's saying,
There
Melina?
has
I mean,
been
I
no
can't
call.
ignore.
Are you listening?
I hear what he's saying.
Your banner,
Of
your
course
banner,
you can't
Black
ignore him
Lives
because
Matter.
he's talking over me, right?
Because you're not responding.
I think that
You're
this is
hitting
again
your
a very
talking points and not answering.
it's a minute, it's a small example of the way in which police continue to try to talk down, talk over.
Virginia's governor says he has no regrets on his comments earlier this week defending abortion, even as a baby is being born.
Here's what Virginia's governor did say.
The infant would be delivered. The infant would be kept comfortable. The infant would be resuscitated if that's what the mother and the family desired. And then a discussion would ensue between the physicians and the mother.
It's found in adult bookstores, video rentals, and sealed in black plastic bags. But the last place parents would expect to find pornography is in the hands of their 10-year-old child. Endorsed by Planned Parenthood, the book It's Perfectly Normal has a label on its front cover stating that it is for ages 10 and up. However, a Washington state jail recently rejected a fundraising letter featuring censored illustrations from the book because they are obscene or sexually explicit material as defined by policy. The content rejected by the prison was described by Planned Parenthood Vice President Michael McGee as delightful, while calling the book itself a boon for kids, their parents, and their teachers. The question is, if these images are too obscene for adult prisoners, why are they good for 10-year-old children? It's Perfectly Normal by Roby Harris has entire chapters devoted to sexual intercourse, contraception, masturbation, homosexuality, and abortion. In several states, the contents of It's Perfectly Normal fall directly under the definition of pornography, and in some cases, child pornography.
From calls to defund the police.
So much of this moment right now is a conversation about funding and abolishing systems that have been in place that have literally been to kill Black people, kill, maim, brutalize, humiliate, torture. As we saw Miriam Kapa's op-ed in the New York Times, yes, when we say defund, we literally mean abolish.
To the murder of police.
Police departments around the country are telling their personnel to be extra vigilant this morning after the killing of two officers in New York City. Officers Rafael Ramos and Wenjen Liu were shot execution-style Saturday in their patrol car.
And to the deadly ambush in Iowa, 2 police officers killed as they sat in their patrol cars.
To assaults on American conservatives.
Tonight, there's finally an arrest in that brutal attack on a conservative volunteer on the campus of UC Berkeley. February 19th, Hayden Williams went to recruit conservative students, and this was the response.
The evening turned deadly when a man standing in front of this parking garage was shot. Not much is known publicly about what led to this moment, but the victim has been linked to a pro-Trump group.
To the arrest of business owners.
The owners of Attilis Gym in Belmar have reopened the gym once again just days after they were arrested. Around 7 this morning, wooden boards blocking the entrance were kicked in and the doors were opened. On Monday, gym owners Ian Smith and Frank Trombetti were taken into custody for repeatedly defying Governor Phil Murphy's shutdown order.
To the lockdown on American churches or synagogues.
Of the 16% of our population that has been tested in Ventura County, a little over 8,000 have been tested positive. Now, if you take those positive cases and, you divide the number of deaths by that number, it works out to less than 1% of those who've tested positive have died from this. And so my point is simply this: we know that the lion's share, more than 70 of the tragic victims, are 65 and older with comorbidities. We're at a point now where they've closed our schools, they've shuttered our businesses. 65% of our restaurants will never reopen again. They have devastated families financially. The emotional toll, they haven't even discussed that. And with that, devastating our businesses, they've seen fit that Dr. Robert Levin, our health officer, who has violated his Form 700 by owning a winery that he is allowed to have remain open while he devastates everyone else's business and doesn't declare it as a public official. He's allowed to do this, but we're not allowed to worship. So they shutter our businesses, destroy our families. They remove our children from schools, traumatize them emotionally, and now they release convicts into our county, and now they're coming to prosecute a church.
From the calls for ending America's free market system.
So let me take this opportunity to define for you, simply and straightforwardly, what democratic socialism means to me. It means building on what Franklin Delano Roosevelt said when he fought for guaranteed economic rights for all Americans. Democratic socialism means that we must reform a political system which is corrupt.
What we should be doing is shunning these people. Shunning, shaming these people is a statement of moral indignation that these people are not fit for polite society. It's not only that Trump has to lose, but that all his enablers have to lose. We have to collectively, in essence, burn down the Republican Party. We have to level them, because if there are survivors, if there are people who weather this storm, they will do it again.
To the burning and looting of American businesses and cities, not to mention the murder of Americans for simply defending those businesses.
This is David Dorn in his very last moments on Earth. He's bleeding to death on a sidewalk in front of a looted shop. He's a former police captain protecting a store. His name, David Dorn. He was 77. His death filmed on Facebook Live. He was a black man, a family man, a good man. Black Lives Matter, but not to looters, rioters, and agitators. Shall we blame this on systemic racism?
To the murder of American Jews worshiping in their synagogues.
The one thing they had in common, their Jewish faith. That is what brought them to the Tree of Life Synagogue Saturday morning, where they lost their lives in the deadliest attack on Jews in American history.
To the murder of children outside of the womb that is now, here in 2020, legal in at least 19 states.
But your Democrat governor here in Wisconsin shockingly stated that he will veto legislation that protects Wisconsin babies born alive. Born alive. The baby is born. The mother meets with the doctor. They take care of the baby. They wrap the baby beautifully. And then the doctor and the mother determine whether or not they will execute the baby. I don't think so. Incredible. No, it's incredible. Until this crazy man in Virginia said it, nobody even thought of that, right? Did anyone even think of that? You hear late term. But this is where the baby is actually born. It came out. It's there. It's wrapped. And that's it.
It's obvious that a woman is about to give birth. She has physical signs of that she is about to give a birth. Would that still be a point at which she could request an abortion if she was so certified? She's dilating.
My bill would allow that, yes.
These are but a few examples of how America has spiraled to the brink of societal collapse because of the lawlessness and violence from enemies, both foreign and domestic, that I believe have carried out successful brainwashing programs. However, the tactics, philosophies, and values of America's enemies would be rendered virtually impotent at tearing the fabric of our society if their worldview had not found a prepared, conditioned, and fertile soil in the minds of Americans due to brainwashing. Sadly, it's not just the useful idiots in the streets with their violence toward Americans, business owners, property, Secret Service agents, police officers that have revealed they have been successfully brainwashed. Shockingly, and perhaps to our ultimate collapse as a free society, police officers, FBI agents, military officers, and soldiers have also been brainwashed to become the useful idiots of the communist globalist agenda by taking a knee before anti-American revolutionaries.
Can you take a kneel? Can you take a kneel? I don't know. They ain't enough for me. Let me see. They ain't enough for me. Thank you. Thank you. Let me see you take a kneel. They ain't enough for me. Let me see you take a kneel. Let me see you take a kneel. Thank you.
Those within law enforcement and the U.S. military that have engaged in such asinine behavior have effectively broken their sworn oath to defend America from enemies, both foreign and domestic. Their foolish belief that they could find some kind of common ground, dialogue, or even gain credibility or respect from the communist street thugs by taking a knee reveals that they have been brainwashed to one degree or another. A free society, a constitutional republic, to which these public officials swore to uphold, can in no way find common ground with socialists, communists, Marxists, anarchists, or globalists. Such moronic thinking not only empowers the anti-American revolutionaries, but guarantees that the weakness of such fools that have taken the knee will almost certainly find themselves once again on their knees. The next time, however, it might be they find themselves on their knees begging before their new masters for their very life or that of their loved ones or fellow Americans.
Excuse me. Hey, excuse me. I work for Black Lives Matter. I'm sorry. I work for Black Lives Matter. I'm sorry that I scared you. But since I work for that company, my CEO has told me to come out today and to bring you on your knees because you have white privilege. So if they see that a white person is getting on their knees, that shows solidarity for the situation. And could you just please apologize for your white privilege? Just apologize. It's big. It's large in this country. You know, with this country, we have that President Donald Duck, that clown in office. You know, he's brought a lot of bigotry, and you're not a part of it, right? No.
I also think that it might, I think of a lot of things. The first thing I think is that we actually do have an ideological frame. Myself and Alicia in particular are trained organizers. We are trained Marxists. We are super versed on sort of ideological theories.
Opal Tometi is a strong supporter of Venezuela's Marxist dictator, Nicolas Maduro. Both Opal Tometi and Alicia Garza are involved with the German revolutionary organization Rosa Luxemburg Stiftung. Based in Berlin, with offices in Beijing, Moscow, and Manhattan, the organization was established by former East German Communist Party leaders to build a new wave of international socialist revolutions.
If this country doesn't give us what we want, then we will burn down this system and replace it. All right. And I could be speaking figuratively. Okay. I could be speaking literally. It's a matter of interpretation.
How did we reach this point? The answer requires this historical, factual, and sobering documovie. Yet, the question can be answered in 4 words. Americans have been brainwashed. After years and years of research and study, I will, through this documovie, reveal to you 12 steps that I have discovered that have been used over and over since at least the 1930s to brainwash billions of people to this day and counting. Brainwashed America, Part 1 begins right now.
This is a Brennan House and WVW Broadcast Network docu-movie, Brainwashed America. 12 historically documented tactics actively used by the communists to capture the minds of Americans and collapse the United States from within. And now, here is your host, Brennan House.
One survey after another reveals that a majority of today's millennials want to live under some form of socialism. A shocking number of Americans do not know the difference between a democracy or a constitutional republic. Far too many Americans know little, if anything, about what has made America great, or the values and virtues that have made us the longest-running constitutional republic in the history of the world. Far too many Americans no longer believe in absolute truth, or that God himself has ordained a standard by which men should live and by which one day they will be judged. Many Americans have proven they have been brainwashed by believing that the source of all suffering and oppression is Christianity and the free market system. Social justice propagandist Shaun King described that statues of Jesus should be torn down as they promote white supremacy.
Look at this tweet from a far-left activist, Shaun King. I can barely believe this, but I'll read it for you. Yes, I think the statues of the white European they claim is Jesus should also come down. They are a form of white supremacy, always have been. In the Bible, when the family of Jesus wanted to hide and blend in, guess where they went? Egypt, not Denmark. Tie them down.
Even the U.S. Army found itself in the summer of 2020 having to pull a handout to troops that stated that the slogan, quote, "Make America Great Again," end quote, or the acronym MAGA, showed sympathy toward white supremacy. Countless Americans now believe that America's founding fathers were racist, despite the numerous founders that never owned slaves, and the many that openly wrote about the need to abolish slavery. In fact, some schools now teach that America's founding fathers were actually terrorists.
A developing controversy concerning the Department of Defense and a new training manual that compares modern-day extremists with some of America's founding fathers. The Boston Tea Party has already been deemed an act of terror in some U.S. school districts, and now it seems the Department of Defense, at least according to this training manual, thinks the men who signed the Declaration of Independence weren't much better. A portion of the new manual reads, quote, "In U.S. history, there are many examples of extremist ideologies and movements. The colonists who sought to free themselves from British rule, and the Confederate States who sought to secede from the northern states. Those are just two examples. Nowadays, instead of dressing in sheets or publicly espousing hate messages, many extremists will talk of individual liberties, states' rights, and how to make the world a better place."
According to the propagandists, the founders were terrorists. But if you point out the connection between terrorism and Islam, well, then you're practicing Islamophobia, and thus, you are a racist. So successful has the brainwashing operation in America been that in the summer of 2020, Americans were tearing down one statue after another of American patriots. Patriots that sacrificed their lives, their fortunes, and their sacred honor that America might be conceived. But it is not just the patriots of the past that are under siege, but the patriots of today. If you stand for the national anthem, celebrate the 4th of July, and believe in the free market system, national borders, and national sovereignty, then you are a racist according to the purveyors of the politically correct propaganda that is at the very foundation of their brainwashing operation.
Philip Agnew with the Dream Defenders says the movement for justice in the midst of a pandemic should make the 4th of July hard for anyone to celebrate this year.
Instead of fireworks, instead of picnics, instead of huge gatherings on the water or in places around the cities in this country, people are actually going to have to sit and face and reconcile and acknowledge what this country is. It is a country that was founded on the exploitation and the thievery of labor from Black people.
Researcher and author Edward Hunter is reported to be the first person to use the English term brainwashing. In fact, in 1956, his book Brainwashing was released. Mr. Hunter correctly noted, quote, "No man has ever been brainwashed whose mind has not first been put into a fog. The patient first has to be deprived of his bearings, to be shaken loose from whatever belief and convictions he formerly held until he loses faith in them entirely," end quote.
In the time that we have, and I know it's going by rapidly, Mr. Hunter, I would like to have you give me very simply, if it is possible, the techniques of what we call brainwashing.
Brainwashing consists of two processes. One process is softening up. The other process is indoctrination. Softening up is what mainly took place in the prisoner of war camps in Korea. And softening up is what is taking place in the United States today. Each of these two processes is composed of a number of elements that include threats, tenseness, fatigue, hunger, atrocities, pressures of that sort. I write about them in the book Brainwashing in Red China.
Are there people and organizations here in the United States prone to the brainwashing technique?
Do you mean agencies of government?
Correct.
Yes, excuse me. I think there are various agencies studying brainwashing. But what worries me much more is the intrigue, the intriguing effect this has had upon some of our politicians and some of our people in executive offices who have become enamored of it and forget that this is something that is not intended to be used for political purposes against the American public, but against an enemy. And it is now, under such names as news management, which means lying to the American public, or distorting information, being utilized by our government against our people.
Hunter studied how the communists took over China in 1949 and then set out to brainwash the more than 550 million citizens of China, brainwashing them to embrace communism. Hunter's work assisted me in identifying the 12 techniques of brainwashing that is vital for you to understand in order to expose and interrupt the brainwashing operation. Another author that greatly assisted me in my research was Dr. William E. Mayer. Dr. Mayer was an American psychiatrist that served in the Korean War and was awarded the Bronze Star with Valor. Dr. Mayer was a medical doctor trained in neurology, psychiatry, neuropathology, and military medicine. Mr. Mayer served in the Reagan administration in the 1980s, and his official obituary includes these notable accomplishments. Quote, he served 6 years in the Pentagon as Assistant Secretary of Defense, Health Affairs, responsible for the health care of the nearly 10 million active duty and retired military personnel and their families worldwide, and was Assistant Surgeon General of the United States, end quote. Like Edward Hunter, Mr. Mayer studied the topic of brainwashing. Mr. Mayer studied how our American POWs of the Korean War were brainwashed by the communists during their captivity.
I want to talk to you about the experiences of a remarkably good random cross-sectional sample of healthy adult, young adult American males when these people became the first products of our society and its attitudes and its traditions and its prejudices, ever to live for a prolonged period of time in a communist-controlled environment. And the only such group in existence is the several thousand men who fell into the enemy's hands in the Korean conflict. I've talked about this off and on ever since we finished an intensive study of 1,000 of these men. The weapon we saw in use in Korea did not conform to our preconceived ideas. We thought, for example, that it would primarily be one of physical coercion. Burning bamboo splinters under the fingernails, everybody knows, are used by all Orientals when they want information from you or cooperation. The average soldier knew about this much about the Oriental culture, and he was indeed surprised immediately after capture to be welcomed with the outstretched hand of friendship, a pat on the back, a cigarette, and reassurances that he would not be destroyed, that he too was considered a member of the people, that he was not going to be put to work or enslaved, that he was going to be treated well and given a chance to learn the truth. And we had to learn this too when we studied these men. It was very difficult to accept the idea that they had not been physically coerced. And yet 95% of all the men captured in Korea stated that at no time had they been subject to any physical abuse, ever. We found also that they didn't use drugs or narcotics to coerce men. We thought they might. The communist world, China in particular, is responsible for a great deal of illicit narcotic traffic in America, but this was not the case in Korea. We thought maybe, after all, Pavlov was a Russian, even though he was pre-revolutionary, we thought maybe they used psychological magic of some sort, stimulus deprivation or subliminal stimulation or some corruption of Pavlovian conditioning to instill in these men certain ideas that they couldn't avoid. And those of us who are trained in the psychological sciences felt that this couldn't be supported, even at the beginning, but nonetheless we had to be sure. And it was true. No such special exotic devices were used. We concluded that they'd been brainwashed. As we went into an examination of what had happened, however, we discovered that if there is such a thing as brainwashing, it was really a weapon. And that what we were looking at was very possibly the closest thing to an ultimate weapon that man has yet come up with. Not the end of all weapons, but certainly more effective than any weapon yet devised. This was a weapon designed not to destroy people, because there is a point of diminishing return, as I need hardly point out, to any destructive weapon. It was a weapon designed rather to control groups. Now, the communists have been demonstrably successful in doing just this. They have been more successful than anyone using any other kinds of weapons ever before in the whole history of the human race.
So important is this American history that a fairly young man by the name of Ronald Reagan narrated a short black and white documentary that detailed the research of Dr. William E. Mayer concerning the brainwashing of our American POWs during the Korean War. During the production of this documovie, I contacted the Ronald Reagan Presidential Library to request a high-resolution copy of the black and white documentary narrated by Ronald Reagan. I was introduced to an archivist that has been on staff at the Reagan Library for many years. After explaining to him my goals for this documovie, he informed me that indeed the Reagan Presidential Library had the footage I was seeking, and he'd be happy to send it to me. He further informed me that I was the first project that they have ever released this footage to that was being kept safe in their temperature-controlled vault. I want to thank the Ronald Reagan Presidential Library for sharing this footage with me. My friends, here is Ronald Reagan warning about the power and dangers of brainwashing.
Our men in Korean captivity, like most of the people held in this new tyranny, did not accept communism. But not all of what they heard there was foreign to them, for the groundwork had partly been laid right here at home. In some degree, then, we fail our test in small ways and large ways, when we do to ourselves the very things the communist tries so hard to do with his captive peoples and captive nations. The cheating businessman and the cheating student alike hasten the process. Those who seek more and more relief from government to solve the problems of life, old age, unemployment, guaranteed security, who are willing and eager to have hard decisions made for them by remote authority. They hasten the process. Our enemies are largely within ourselves. Indifference, passiveness, a lack of standards and values about right and wrong, good and bad. Though these things are often excused as universal or even extolled as virtues, broad-mindedness, tolerance, or sophistication, they can be as deadly and destroy us just as surely as any nuclear device or missile or other hardware. They constitute the true fallout, the moral fallout, against which free men must forever give battle if our freedom and its manifold blessings are to endure. The ultimate weapon for this battle is the mind, the heart, the spirit of free men. This is what Dr. Mayer and the men who worked with him think can be learned from the Korean experience. This is a lesson we must learn.
As of 2020, I have spent 30 years researching, writing, and speaking on such topics as outcome-based education that was hiding under such federal education programs as America 2000, Goals 2000, No Child Left Behind, and Common Core. These programs, of course, were largely based on the brainwashing techniques of psychologist Benjamin Bloom and behavioral psychologist B.F. Skinner. So the fact of the matter is, I have been studying this topic of brainwashing intensely since at least 1990. Through these 30 years of studying the propaganda of the communist, Marxist, globalist, and specific cults, I was able to identify what I believe are 12 processes that are used to brainwash subjects. All of these 12 techniques have been successfully carried out for decades in America. These processes are accelerating to accomplish the almost complete Marxist revolution now underway in America. Any successful public speaker knows that one of the keys to effective communication and instruction is to tell your audience what it is you're going to teach them, then teach it to them, and finally, tell them in conclusion what it is that you taught them. So with that process in mind, let me share with you the 12 systematic steps of brainwashing that I have uncovered through my research since 1990. I will be explaining to you in great detail in this documovie, historically, how these steps have been and are to this very day being carried out in order to brainwash the targeted subjects. In this case, to brainwash Americans. Number 1, remove or discredit leaders that are principled, courageous, and people of convictions and morality. Number 2, entice the brainwashing subjects into questioning and doubting their foundational worldview, values, and convictions. 3, teach a revisionist history that portrays America's capitalist free market system as the source of all suffering and oppression. 4, teach moral relativism and situational ethics in order to destroy morality and character. 5, teach the importance of group consensus and collectivism and the danger and consequences of individuality. Number 6, teach feelings and personal and subjective experiences over facts, reason, logic, and context. 7, put the brainwashing subjects into a state of fear, anxiety, confusion, and social turbulence in order to diminish the subject's ability to think critically using reason, logic, and context. The ultimate goal is to force the subject or subjects to surrender their individuality, values, and worldview to those of the change agents and their controlled and crafted group consensus. Number 8, conceal the lies and evil agenda of the propagandist behind masking terms that are chosen in order to shame and manipulate the targeted subjects into willingly embracing their own demise. Number 9, use individuals in trusted institutions and occupations to give credibility to the worldview and values being inculcated into the brainwashing subjects. 10, set up a system of rewards, honor, and recognition and advancement for those who embrace the worldview and values of the brainwashing program. Apply punitive consequences on any worldview and values that are contrary to the chosen worldview and values being inculcated into the brainwashing subjects. Number 11, use informants, gossips, and tattletales to report on non-compliance of individuals and groups. 12, create an atmosphere and environment of chaos, suffering, hopelessness, and danger, and then rescue the subjects from this condition so that the persecutor is perceived as being a friend, protector, and savior. These, my friends, are the 12 steps of brainwashing that I have uncovered after years of research. But what is the very definition of brainwashing? Merriam-Webster Dictionary defines brainwashing as, quote, a forcible indoctrination to induce someone to give up basic political, social, and religious beliefs and attitudes and to accept contrasting, regimented ideas, end quote. It's also defined as, quote, persuasion by propaganda or salesmanship, end quote. The Psychological Dictionary defines brainwashing as, quote, a method that manipulates and modifies a person's emotions, attitudes, and beliefs. It utilizes intensely persuasive, even coercive tactics in order to enforce these changes, end quote. The term brainwashing has been largely connected to the 1949 Communist Revolution in China due to the research and writings of Edward Hunter. Hunter served for 2 years as a, quote, propaganda specialist, end quote, for the Office of Strategic Services during World War II. In his 1956 book, Brainwashing, Hunter writes, quote, the new word, haramwashing, entered our minds and dictionaries in a phenomenally short time. This sinister political expression had never been in print anywhere until a few years ago. The word came out of the sufferings of the Chinese people. Put under a terrifying combination of subtle and crude mental and physical pressures and tortures, they detected a pattern and called it brainwashing. The Reds wanted people to believe that it could be amply described by some familiar expressions such as education, public relations, persuasion, or by some misleading term like mind reform and re-education. None of these could define it because it was much, much more than any one of them alone. The Chinese knew they hadn't just been educated or persuaded. Something much more dire than that had been perpetrated on them, similar in many ways to a medical treatment. What they had undergone was more like witchcraft, with its incantations, trances, poisons, and potions, with a strange flair of science about it all. Like a devil dancer in a tuxedo carrying his magic brew in a test tube. The communist hierarchy preferred people to believe that there was no such thing as brainwashing, so long as they could keep it concealed without a name. Opposition to it could be kept scattered and ineffective. The German-born sinologue Max Perleberg, who is fluent in both modern and classical Chinese, told me that the term might well have been derived from the Buddhist expression heart-washing, which goes to the time of Min Shaez, a middle-aged man, perhaps weary of worldly care, living in a bare pavilion in some placid corner of his garden, leaving his offspring to attend to his business, end quote. Notice that Hunter points out that, quote, the communist hierarchy preferred people to believe that there was no such thing as brainwashing. He says, quote, so long as they could keep it concealed without a name, opposition to it could be kept scattered and ineffective, end quote. As I have stated, I have spent decades conducting the research upon which this docu-movie is based. And my goal is to help you identify the tactics of brainwashing, name it, call it out, refute it, and destroy it. While working on the script for this documovie, I wondered many times, how could I most effectively communicate to my audience just how dangerous and deliberate are the techniques of brainwashing? I needed to convey to you, my audience, how the techniques of brainwashing, the manipulation, and the control are often undetectable to the untrained individual. What culturally, historically, politically, and economically could I point to in order to prove to my audience they have been subjected to the lies, manipulation, and deception of a brainwashing operation? What one thing could I use that would be very compelling? And then the communist Chinese coronavirus and its exploitation of 2020 occurred.
Now let's get to it. It has to do with COVID-19. And the World Health Organization has just declared a global coronavirus. It is a pandemic at this point.
Now, please understand this. I'm not denying the reality of the coronavirus or COVID-19. I'm not denying that many people became very sick or even developed respiratory infections that resulted in their death. However, it is a proven fact that the fatality rate of those that contracted the coronavirus or COVID-19 were around the average age of 78 years of age. And many of those patients had underlying conditions. When I began to report on the coronavirus in January of 2020 on my national radio show, I urged caution because of the possibility, as stated by U.S. Senator Tom Cotton, that the virus could have come from a level 4 bioweapons lab in Wuhan, China. However, within a few short weeks, based on countless hours of research and conversations with national security and medical experts, I began to warn my radio and television audience that the virus was going to be used as a political, social, and economic weapon to greatly transform America and even the world. I warned that fear and anxiety would be used to convince Americans to give up their liberties, freedoms, and way of life in a manner that would have been unthinkable in 2019. So unthinkable that anyone presenting a movie script in 2019 on the actual events that unfolded in 2020 would have been ridiculed as impossible and not a plausible script or prediction. They would have never believed in 2019 that in 2020, Americans could be so easily manipulated and controlled by fear, anxiety, contradictory facts, fake science, fake news, manipulated numbers, and tyrannical powers without a good old-fashioned American uprising from coast to coast. Yet, Americans and many others around the world went as lambs to the slaughter and allowed the very lifeblood of their businesses to be drained, their freedoms to travel and move about to be restricted, their ability to socialize outlawed, to be married in a traditional manner eliminated, to collectively mourn at the funeral of a loved one prohibited, the right to congregate and worship criminalized by large fines and even arrest.
Are you open today?
Absolutely.
Okay. I believe you have already been given a warning about being open, not being open.
I'm in compliance, sir.
How are you in compliance?
I went and I changed my license. I'm not just a souvenir store now.
Okay.
I am a department store. Indian department store. I am handling hay. I am handling hay. I am handling paper towels, food, dog food.
Tell you what, go ahead and arrest him, put him in handcuffs, and then a search incident to arrest. Get your hands out. You're under arrest because you're in violation of the healthcare code. That's the misdemeanor.
You guys are a joke, man.
We're going to show you a piece of tape that at first glance looks like it might have taken place in China, but it didn't. It took place in Ohio just recently. A school resource officer tasered and then handcuffed a woman who was watching her son's middle school football game. It happened Wednesday night in Logan, Ohio. Her crime? She wasn't wearing a mask outside. This footage is awful, and the lack of response from the people sitting near this woman as she's tasered is even worse. But we're going to show it to you anyway because this is what's happening in our country. Watch this.
Put your hand behind your back. I will not put my hand behind my back. I'm not pressing doing nothing wrong. Get off of me! What the is wrong with you? Oh my God! Get off of me! You're not arresting me for nothing. I am doing nothing wrong. There's a cop car over there. No, you're not. There's a cop car over there. Do you want to come? Come on!
Tase somebody over a mask. Tasing this lady over not wearing a damn mask. Arresting her for a mask, not wearing a mask. He ain't even got one on.
Right.
Hey, where's your mask?
Remember, we're infected together now, right, guys? We've done this how many times together?
They tased a woman at her son's outdoor football game. Some of the resource officers who ran up weren't wearing masks themselves, and none of the men sitting there did anything about it. It's shocking.
This is the sort of social pressure that we're engaged in right now, and it has real consequences. There are other, even more serious issues than masks coming. There are vaccines, there are test and trace, and how aggressively we're going to isolate people and quarantine them.
Well, 3 Christians were arrested in Moscow Wednesday night for participating in an outdoor worship service. But it wasn't Moscow, Russia. It was Moscow, Idaho. Del Hurd has the story.
Shouldn't be doing this. You guys are tough people. You're wrong.
3 Christians were arrested and 5 were cited by police for not wearing masks or social distancing at a hymn-singing event in Moscow, Idaho's City Hall parking lot Wednesday night. One of those arrested was Latah County Commission candidate Gabe Wrench. During the arrest, church members challenged police officers with the idea that by arresting them, they were actually helping enforce tyranny.
At what point do you fight against tyranny? Do you protect your citizens against tyranny?
What order wouldn't you obey? Like, do you have a line? What order would you not obey?
Father, we ask you to bless now. We ask you to bless the police officer, Lord, while they hear about to give us citation. We pray you'll bless them.
Thursday night service at King James Bible Baptist Church in Greenville, Mississippi. As parishioners sit in their vehicles listening to Pastor Charles Hamilton, Greenville police surround the church parking lot.
They park in their parking spaces. They keep their windows up, the doors closed, and they never get out of the cars like the CDC recommends that they do.
Jeremy Dice with First Liberty Institute is representing Pastor Hamilton and says police were violating the church's constitutional right while enforcing a curfew order from Mayor Eric Simmons.
Look, there's no exception to the United States Constitution for a pandemic. What Mayor Simmons has done is to apply an order without regard to equality. He's singled out churches in particular.
King James Bible Baptist isn't the only Greenville church police visited.
We have everybody stay in their cars with the windows up, and turn and go to a certain radio station.
Lee Gordon says there were about 30 cars in the parking lot of Temple Baptist Church.
Police started coming up, and we said, no, we think we're in our rights. So they started issuing tickets, $500 tickets. I don't know, it may have been 20 to 30 tickets. Everybody got one. It wasn't per car. There was, me and my wife was in a car together, and both of us got tickets.
If we don't open, we won't be able to recover.
Lou Uredell was arrested, cited, then released on Sunday for reopening the Metroflex gym against county public health orders.
$1,000 each, and up to 6 months in jail.
Luther owns a salon in Dallas. It was shut down like every salon across Texas. But she reopened, saying she and her employees have a right to work. The city filed a temporary restraining order in civil court telling her she had to close. She refused and went to jail for violating the judge's order. She served 48 hours of a 7-day sentence.
And yet, once the tragic death of George Floyd occurred, the same politicians and Marxist media members declared that you could not go to church for the social good. Yet they encouraged thousands to join in on the riots, looting, and burning for the Marxist agenda of social justice.
Months ago, scenes like this and this would have been unimaginable. The coronavirus pandemic had shut down the state, empty streets, empty parking lots. Then,
I can breathe.
Protesters filling once empty streets.
Abolish the police.
Calls for social distance taking a back seat to calls for social justice. Some protesters wearing masks, others choosing not to, all standing side by side in the name of justice.
Let's move on to Charlotte, North Carolina, to march against police brutality. Okay, they're welcomed, fine. So you're right to peacefully protest. But if thousands of RNC attendees want to rally in Charlotte 2 months from now, they're called irresponsible, dangerous, selfish.
The president's extremely irresponsible, bullying, and potentially deadly threat today in the middle of this deadly pandemic to move the Republican National Convention from Charlotte.
He wants, 20,000 people to gather in the arena there, packed, screaming, shouting on top of each other right in the midst of this pandemic. Is that what he's saying?
Have any of you seen the crowds in Raleigh and Charlotte, North Carolina? Well, if you want to open your restaurant's doors to customers, they're going to stop you, or they're going to send state inspectors, and they're going to have measuring tapes, and they're going to make sure that your salad bar is in order. But if you want to ransack a restaurant, they'll give you the green light. And if you want to go to church, they'll send cops out to harass you. But if you want to burn down the church, they'll basically look the other way or excuse it. If you want to protest the lockdowns at the state capitol, you're called a terrorist and a threat to public health and safety.
Americans were told that going to a conservative political rally was selfish, dangerous, a threat to public safety. And yet, attending a liberal protest or riot was declared vital to stopping the advancement of the so-called fascism of conservatives. Americans were told that for 2 weeks they needed to shut down their schools, businesses, conferences, churches, synagogues, and even social events in their homes in order to flatten the curve and keep the hospitals from filling to beyond capacity. When the overflow of hospitals in the vast majority of American cities did not occur, Americans in many cities were told businesses still must remain closed or adhere to a 50% of capacity policy, a policy that would guarantee that countless businesses would forever have to shut their doors due to bankruptcy. Initially, Americans were told not to wear masks because they were not necessary and they did not prevent the spread of the virus.
Right now in the United States, people should not be walking around with masks.
You're sure of it? Because people are listening really closely to this.
Right now, people should not be walking. There's no reason to be walking around with a mask. When you're in the middle of an outbreak, wearing a mask might make people feel a little bit better, and it might even block a droplet, but it's not providing the perfect protection that people think that it is. And often there are unintended consequences. People keep fiddling with the mask and they keep touching their face.
Stop buying masks. That's the request from the U.S. Surgeon General as fears over the coronavirus are continuing to create chaos.
Then they were told that they must wear a mask and practice social distancing, or they could be fined thousands of dollars, if not arrested.
Putting a mask on yourself is more to prevent you from infecting someone else. And if everybody does that, we're each protecting each other, because the data is it's more efficient to prevent transmitting to others than it is to prevent transmission to yourself.
U.S. authorities directly pleaded with Americans on Tuesday to wear masks to help stop the coronavirus.
The largest employer in America is small business. And yet, many small businesses were forced closed by tyrannical politicians that declared themselves medical and scientific experts. Ironically, many large multinational corporations were allowed to remain open, while mom and pop businesses that sold the same products and services were closed due to legal demands. In some cities, abortion clinics, liquor stores, and pot stores remained open because they were deemed essential services, while gun stores and churches were closed.
This stay-at-home order, California has made it clear pot is considered essential.
Contrary to what some might think, the industry is considered essential, according to the governor's list.
That special order did make it clear that liquor stores here, like Discount Liquor and many others throughout southeastern Wisconsin and the entire state, are considered essential and can remain open.
Well, Ken, this has been an ongoing fight for the past week. The sheriff's deputies actually came here this morning asking the owner to shut it down. The owner refused, and that's when the district attorney actually stepped in, warning of a prosecution, and that's when the owner decided to lock his door.
But here in Nevada, coronavirus, while not stopping any gambling, Vegas is packed right now, it is stopping a lot of small businesses. Small businesses shuttered across the state, as are churches. So churches are not allowed to open their doors, but casinos are wide open.
The church doors were forced closed while the prison doors were flown open in many cities. Why? So that countless criminals could return to the streets. Yet, citizens were told that obtaining a firearm for personal protection was not an essential service. The father of the Communist Manifesto, Karl Marx, said, quote, "My object in life is to dethrone God and destroy capitalism," end quote. Indeed, the communist Chinese coronavirus gave the Marxists here in America a great weapon by which to control when and where people could worship God, and it gave them power to destroy untold numbers of businesses run by free market individuals. The more I study the fake science, contradictions, government overreach, and fear-mongering that has been deployed by change agents, known cultural Marxists, globalists, and socialists within America, the more I believe their response to the coronavirus has been a huge psychological warfare program carried out on the American people. After all, the daily sight of people walking around wearing face masks, the inability to see their smile, and the prison warden-like orders to stay 6 feet apart is all enough to steal your peace, your tranquility, and cause frustration. For some, understandably, it has caused great fear and anxiety. However, fear and anxiety is a powerful tool in a brainwashing operation.
We want to turn now to the important issue of mental health and how to manage stress and anxiety caused by the coronavirus.
Anxiety is a real and understandable feeling right now.
What would your recommendation be, speaking of anxiety? I mean, from so many people that I've talked to, it's like 1 second we're calm and the next second we've read an article from Italy or France and your anxiety is in high gear.
With the number of coronavirus cases rising by the day in the tri-state, fear and anxiety brought on by the virus is rising as well.
It is a time of enormous disruption in America and all around the world as many of our daily routines are being upended. Beyond the cancellations, the medical questions, and financial turmoil, there is fear.
This is the week America learned it was in a true public health crisis, and we're seeing some intense reactions to the news. New Rochelle residents say they have a weariness hitting them and a deep sense of anxiety throughout the community.
Dr. Phil, daily, even hourly, the news changes about the virus, which is causing a lot of people a great deal of anxiety.
Well, odds are you may be experiencing anxiety right now. As the pandemic rolls on, there was a recent survey of over 115,000 people, so it's a big survey, right? ShareCare did it, and they found that a whopping 91% of us, more than 9 out of 10, are experiencing worry.
In my last documentary released in December 2019, Siege, you can obtain a copy and watch 1 hour for free at siegethemovie.com. In this documentary that I will repeat, came out in December of 2019, I had a section on the Tavistock Institute. I warned Americans to be aware of the very psychological operation based on the Tavistock method that was ironically released on Americans and even the world just a few weeks after this documentary, Siege, was released. Again, you can obtain a copy at siegethemovie.com or watch 1 hour for free at siegethemovie.com. The Tavistock Institute of Medical Psychology was founded in 1920, and the Tavistock Institute was started in 1946. Dr. Dennis Cuddy gives some important history when he writes, quote, John Rawlings Rees, who would be a co-founder of the World Federation for Mental Health in 1948, was deputy director of Tavistock at this time. He would become director in 1932. Rees developed the, quote, Tavistock method, end quote, which induces and controls stress via what Rees called, quote, psychologically controlled environments, end quote, in order to make people give up firmly held beliefs under peer pressure, end quote. The goal is to make an example of those that are non-compliant to the agenda of the change agents.
You know the old expression about snitches? Well, in this case, snitches get rewards. We want to thank you for turning folks in and making sure we are all safe.
When you see a crowd, when you see a line that's not distanced, when you see a supermarket that's too crowded, anything, you can report it right away so we can get help there to fix the problem. And now it's as simple as taking a photo. All you gotta do is take the photo and put the location with it, and bang, and we will make sure that enforcement comes right away.
Then a psychological process rooted in brainwashing and control is deployed on the targeted subjects in order to pressure them into surrendering to the predetermined anti-American, anti-Christian values of those running the psychological operation. And those that don't comply, well, they will be embarrassed, labeled as mentally ill, racist, a fascist, suffering from white privilege, toxic masculinity, selfishness, and narcissism. On July 22nd, 2020, Newsweek ran the headline, quote, narcissists and psychopaths are more likely to refuse to wear masks, says new research, end quote. The study by a group of social scientists reported that those that did not comply with mask orders were likely suffering from, quote, dark triad traits, narcissism, psychopathy, and Machiavellianism, end quote. Those that refused to conform to the herd mentality, fake science, hysteria, and tyrannical orders to wear a mask likely saw, according to the report, the, quote, government coronavirus restrictions as a challenge to the individual's illusion of power, end quote. The Newsweek article reported, quote, the study found that being rivalrous, caring little for others, and cynical and power-seeking may create a perfect storm, or dispositions that lead to an unwillingness to comply in a combative way, end quote. In early 2020, the CDC encouraged people not to wear a face mask. And then they did a 180, and the CDC said individuals should wear a face mask. Then there was the flip-flopping of Anthony Fauci. The constant contradictory information, whether on purpose or not, is key to confusing people and causing them to be so overwhelmed that they don't know who or what to believe, and thus they just follow the herd. One sure way to get Americans to let go of their values, reason, and logic, and ultimately their freedoms, is to subject them to peer pressure by convincing them that they are in the minority. Not only must they be convinced that they are in the minority, but they must be afraid of being labeled or ridiculed by the majority for their so-called unacceptable or selfish practice of their liberties, or the practice of their deeply held conservative or religious views. The Tavistock Institute of Medical Psychology, as we said, was founded in 1920, and then the Tavistock Institute itself was started in 1946. The Tavistock Institute studied how to bombard individuals with stress, and then a period of calm, then truth mixed with lies. This mental assault using the Hegelian dialectic process of opposites in constant conflict would confuse the subjects and leave them unable to reason or even concentrate for any length of time. The manufactured chaos, in part, was intended to mimic the emotions, fear, and anxiety an individual would experience in a time of war. Psychiatrist Dr. William Sargent of the Tavistock Institute explained this process in his 1957 book, Battle for the Mind. He wrote, quote, various types of belief can be implanted in many people after brain function has been sufficiently disrupted by accidentally or deliberately induced fear, anger, or excitement. One of the results caused by such disturbances, the most common one, is temporarily impaired judgment and heightened suggestibility. Its various group manifestations are sometimes classed under the heading of herd instincts and appear most spectacular in wartime, during severe epidemics, and in all similar periods of common danger, which increase anxiety and so individual and mass suggestibility, end quote. To accomplish this goal of confusion, anxiety, fear, and mass suggestibility, the Tavistock Institute and many change agents have come to understand the power of what is known as cognitive dissonance. The Psychological Dictionary defines cognitive dissonance as, quote, a state of conflict occurring when beliefs or assumptions are contradicted by new information, end quote. My research has led me to believe that the stages desired by change agents and social engineers using this cognitive dissonance is as follows. Number 1, conflict. 2, stress. 3, anxiety. 4, fear. 5, isolation. 6, surrender. 7, behavior modification. Another way to think of cognitive dissonance is to think of how political correctness has and is being used to shame people into surrendering to the progressives and their established community standards. In other words, political correctness equals shame, equals surrender. The result of this brainwashing operation, as formulated by such individuals as the Tavistock Institute or the Frankfurt School, has led many adults to lose their ability to think with reason, logic, and context. In fact, it has many adults thinking like immature children. Most American adults do not understand what is happening or why. As the events of the world speed up and become more dangerous and complex, they don't seek answers or understanding, but a retreat from the real issues of the day into a type of mental protectionism found in things that are simplistic, fairy tale-like, and even fake, such as social media. To put it into today's vernacular, they retreat to their safe place or happy place and reject reality. This leaves millions of American adults, who simply check out of society and either don't vote or vote based on how those controlling the media and the educational system and the religious institutions tell them to vote. The end result is a nation of infantile adults who cannot think for themselves and are easily controlled, manipulated, and enslaved to the benefit of a controlling class of cultural Marxists and change agents. My research has revealed that when the Tavistock method is deployed, the method produces, number 1, contradicting messages. 2, mind fog. 3, the inability to reason. 4, infantile adults. 5, apathy. 6, surrender. This psychological warfare has been waged on the American people for so many years that only a small minority of adults actually have the ability to think, reason, and lead. Thus, when thinking Americans share with their family, friends, and even church members the truth about such things as social justice, white privilege, false teachers, globalism, Islam, and any other numerous, clear, and present dangers facing us both physically and spiritually, they are told by family and friends that they are not interested in the topics as they are too negative. In some cases, the person speaking truth is silenced by being called names such as divisive, intolerant, a conspiracy theorist, or even arrogant for daring to be so confident in their belief and convictions, despite them being based upon fact and confirmed through extensive study, research, and due diligence. Fred Emery was a senior staff member with the Tavistock Institute of Human Relations. Emery wrote a book entitled Futures We Are In. In this book, Emery explained the tool of social turbulence. My friend Dr. Dennis Cuddy wrote, that according to Emery's social turbulence theory, quote, many individuals faced with a series of crises will attempt to reduce the tensions by adaptation and eventually psychological retreat, end quote. Edward Bernays was the nephew of Sigmund Freud. Bernays was a much praised expert in the area of public relations and propaganda. He worked with governments and corporations in how to control the masses and influence them both politically and in their purchases. Bernays was concerned with how to use crowd psychology to achieve a herd instinct, just as desired by the Tavistock Institute. In his 1928 book entitled Propaganda, he wrote, quote, those who manipulate the organized habits and options of the masses constitute an invisible government, which is the true ruling power of the country. It remains a fact that in almost every act of our lives, whether in the sphere of politics or business, in our social conduct or our ethical thinking, we are dominated by the relatively small number of persons. It is they who pull the wires, which control the public mind and guide the world. As civilization has become more complex and as the need for invisible government has been increasingly demonstrated, the technical means have been invented and developed by which opinion may be regimented, end quote. Today, we would likely call this invisible government referred to by Bernays as the deep state, or a shadow government, or the power elite. The goals of the brainwashing operation carried out by the folks at the Tavistock Institute or the Frankfurt School include the following. 1, destruction of firmly held beliefs based upon absolute truth. 2, destruction of biblical morality, convictions, and beliefs. 3, destruction of the traditional family and sexuality. 4, destruction of the free market capitalist system and private property. 5, destruction of national sovereignty in order to aid the rise of globalism. 6, destruction of masculine conservative leaders. 7, destruction of individuality and individual rights. 8, destruction of the influence of Christianity. 9, destruction of America as a constitutional republic. These, my friends, are goals that I've come up with that I believe are, well, some of the very important objectives of those trying to carry out a brainwashing operation in America today. The Rockefellers funded the Tavistock Institute. Did you hear what I just said? The Rockefellers funded the Tavistock Institute. That, again, is a matter of historical fact. And ironically, it's the Rockefellers that are now behind many agendas that the communist Chinese coronavirus has apparently furthered. In fact, the Rockefellers produced a document in 2010 that pretty much predicted the 2020 coronavirus and the tyrannical response. The Rockefellers sponsored a report. Here it is. Again, please remember, it was written in 2010. You can get a copy of it just as I have online. It's called Scenarios for the Future of Technology and International Development, sponsored by the Rockefellers. In this report, we find a section entitled Lockstep. Remember, the Rockefeller report was written in 2010, but the report included a fictional scenario set in 2012. The report reads as follows, quote, in 2012, the pandemic that the world had been anticipating for years finally hit. Unlike 2009's H1N1, this new influenza strain, originating from wild geese, was extremely virulent and deadly. Even the most pandemic-prepared nations were quickly overwhelmed when the virus streaked across the world, infecting nearly 20% of the global population and killing 8 million in just 7 months. The majority of them healthy young adults. The pandemic also had a deadly effect on economies. International mobility of both people and goods screeched to a halt, debilitating industries like tourism and breaking the global supply chains. Even locally, normally bustling shops and office buildings sat empty for months, devoid of both employees and customers. The pandemic blanketed the planet, though disproportionate numbers died in Africa, Southeast Asia, and Central America, where the virus spread like wildfire in the absence of official containment protocols. But even in developed countries, containment was a challenge. The United States' initial policy of strongly discouraging citizens from flying proved deadly in its leniency, accelerating the spread of the virus, not just within the U.S., but across borders. However, a few countries did fare better, China in particular, end quote. Notice how the report praises the response of China. Now remember, this Rockefeller-sponsored report was written in 2010 with a fake scenario they placed as occurring in 2012. The report continues, quote, during the pandemic, national leaders around the world flexed their authority and imposed airtight rules and restrictions, from the mandatory wearing of face masks to body temperature checks at the entries to communal spaces like train stations and supermarkets. Even after the pandemic faded, this more authoritarian control and oversight of citizens and their activities stuck and even intensified. In order to protect themselves from the spread of increasingly global problems, from pandemics and transnational terrorism to environmental crises and rising poverty, leaders around the world took a firmer grip on power. At first, the notion of a more controlled world gained wide acceptance and approval. Citizens willingly gave up some of their sovereignty and their privacy to more paternalistic states in exchange for greater safety and stability. Citizens were more tolerant and even eager for top-down direction and oversight, and national leaders had more latitude to impose order in the ways they saw fit. In developed countries, this heightened oversight took many forms. Biometric IDs for all citizens, for example, and tighter regulation of key industries whose stability was deemed vital to national interest. And many developed countries enforced cooperation with a suite of new regulations and agreements, slowly but steadily restored both order and, importantly, economic growth, end quote. Notice the fictional Rockefeller scenario predicted the American people would embrace the loss of their liberties and freedoms with the promise of returning their lives and the economy to normal, the new normal. In 1984, former KGB officer Yuri Bezmenov defected to the United States. He sought to warn Americans about the 4 stages of a Marxist revolution and the role that brainwashing plays. I played these clips in my documovie Siege, which again came out in 2019. My friends, Americans were warned long before 2020 what was coming. Remember now, these warnings were coming from a former KGB officer in 1984. He warned that the revolution fooled by brainwashing ends with a new normal.
The first one being demoralization. It takes from 15 to 20 years to demoralize a nation. Why that many years? Because this is the minimum number of years which requires to educate one generation of students in the country of your enemy, exposed to the ideology of the enemy. In other words, Marxism-Leninism ideology is being pumped into the soft heads of at least 3 generations of American students without being challenged or counterbalanced by the basic values of Americanism, American patriotism. The demoralization process in the United States is basically completed already. For the last 25 years, actually it's overfulfilled, because demoralization now reaches such areas where previously not even Comrade Andropov and all his experts would even dream of such a tremendous success. Most of it is done by Americans to Americans, thanks to lack of moral standards. As I mentioned before, exposure to true information does not matter anymore. A person who was demoralized is unable to assess true information. The facts tell nothing to him. The next stage is destabilization. This time, subverter does not care about your ideas and the patterns of your consumption. Whether you eat junk food and get fat and flabby, it doesn't matter anymore. This time, and it takes only from 2 to 5 years to destabilize a nation, what matters is essentials: economy, foreign relations, defense systems. And you can see it quite clearly that in some areas, in such sensitive areas as defense and economy, the influence of Marxist-Leninist ideas in the United States is absolutely fantastic. I could never believe it 14 years ago when I landed in this part of the world that the process will go that fast. The next stage, of course, is crisis. It may take only up to 6 weeks to bring a country to the verge of crisis. You can see it in Central America now. And after crisis, with a violent change of power, structure, and economy, you have so-called the period of normalization. It may last indefinitely. Normalization is a cynical expression borrowed from Soviet propaganda. When the Soviet tanks moved into Czechoslovakia in '68, Comrade Brezhnev said, "Now the situation in brotherly Czechoslovakia is normalized." This is what will happen in the United States if you allow all these schmucks to bring the country to crisis, to promise people all kind of goodies and the paradise on earth, to destabilize your economy, to eliminate the principle of free market competition, and to put a big brother government in Washington, D.C. Situation is disgustingly out of control. Most of the American politicians, media, and educational system trains another generation of people who think they are living at a peacetime. False. United States is in a state of war, undeclared total war against the basic principles and the foundations of this system. The time bomb is ticking. With every second, the disaster is coming closer and closer. Unlike myself, you will have nowhere to defect to.
Demoralize, destabilize, chaos, and the new normal after the revolution. As we're filming here in the fall of 2020, America is clearly in the chaos stage of the 4 steps of revolution, just as Yuri warned in 1984. Sadly, America appears to be in the early stages of a pre-Marxist revolution. Whether we turn back this revolution is yet to be seen, as it is yet not known if the silent majority of Americans will allow this red-green revolution to be successful. The red being the Marxist, the green being that which represents the Islamic agenda in their jihadi flags. For more details on the red-green axis of which I'm speaking, I recommend my first documentary, Sabotage, that came out in 2018. It's 6 hours long. You can watch 1 hour for free or order it at sabotagethemovie.com. That's sabotagethemovie.com. Ironically, also in 1984, the book The Power to Lead was written by globalist James McGregor Burns. He, like the 2010 Rockefeller document entitled Lockstep, seemed to lay out a portion of the blueprint for how Americans could be conditioned and manipulated into surrendering their liberties. The key would be fear, anxiety, and crisis and chaos. He wrote, quote, "Let us face reality. The framers of the Constitution have simply been too shrewd for us. They have outwitted us. They designed separated institutions that cannot be united by mechanical linkages, frail bridges, or tinkering. If we are to turn the founders upside down, we must directly confront the constitutional structure they erected. Others might press for major constitutional restructuring, but I don't think that Americans, under normal conditions, could agree on the package of radical and alien constitutional changes that would be required. They would do so, I think, only during and following a stupendous national crisis." End quote. Notice the goal of the globalist, the cultural Marxist, the communist, the internationalist, the statist, whatever you want to call them. The goal is to convince the American people to reject their own history, heritage, heroes, and patriotism. The end goal is revolution in America by infiltrating all the American power centers with their brainwashing propaganda that was masquerading as entertainment, education, religion, or even mental health. Sadly, many Americans have and continue to aid the Marxist and globalist by concealing the truth about the brainwashing operations that have been underway in America for decades. Some of them mock those of us who warn. Those that try and present the goals and tactics of the power elite and their change agents are often accused of believing in conspiracy theories. Such character assassination of those of us that speak truth comes not only from the media, but from government officials, educators, and even deceived and duped religious useful idiots. Americans that discourage or seek to discredit the dissemination of documented, factual, and historically proven facts about brainwashing by labeling it such things as conspiracy theories are in fact aiding the enemies of America. How? By helping them conceal their agenda so that it can be more effective. One of the most powerful weapons to disrupt and destroy a brainwashing operation is to expose it, name it, and refute it with the kryptonite of brainwashing, the truth. To this very day, communist countries continue to orchestrate disinformation campaigns and psychological warfare upon Americans because they know they have had success for many generations. In 1998, Through the Eyes of the Enemy was published. The book was written by Stanislav Lunev. Lunev was Russia's highest-ranking military defector. He had worked for the GRU, which is the Military Intelligence Division of the former Soviet Union, and he defected in 1992. Lunev reveals many important historical facts in his book. However, one historical fact is very relevant in revealing the long-standing and successful information warfare or brainwashing operation that has been carried out on Americans by communist nations. Lunev writes that Americans were brainwashed through such American power centers as the media, education, and religion, among others. They were brainwashed to believe lies about the Vietnam War, lies about our military, our mission, and the long-term and generational consequences to America should the communists win the Vietnam War and extend their march around the globe. Lunev writes, quote, "What will be a great surprise to the American people is that the GRU and KGB had a larger budget for anti-war propaganda in the United States than it did for economic and military support for the Vietnamese. The anti-war propaganda cost the GRU more than $1 billion, but as history shows, it was a hugely successful campaign and well worth the cost. The anti-war sentiment created an incredible momentum that greatly weakened the U.S. military," end quote. While the Vietnam protests and counterculture is part of American history, few seem to have learned the lesson that our national enemies will exploit and fund any movement that they believe will assist in the destruction of America from within and further their information warfare on the minds of Americans. Even the liberal foreign policy website declared in June of 2020 that the Black Lives Matter movement could count communist China as an ally, just as researcher and author Trevor Loudon documented sitting at this very news desk.
Freedom Road Socialist Organization, the pro-Chinese communist group that gave us the Black Lives Matter movement.
When did that group start?
Freedom Road Socialist Organization started in the 80s, but it came out of the Maoist movement of the 60s.
And when you say Maoist, to those who may know, you're referring to the communist leader of Mao.
Yeah, Mao Zedong. So it was the radical anti-Vietnam War movement, the Weather Underground, Students for a Democratic Society,
Weather Underground,
Revolutionary
Bill Ayers.
Communist, Bill Ayers. They were Maoists. They believed in the Chinese version of communism. So Freedom Road Freedom Road Socialist Organization pulled all the remnants of that movement together into one group called Freedom Road Socialist Organization. They are the founders of the Black Lives Matter movement.
Minneapolis communists from Freedom Road Socialist Organization claim credit for sparking recent riots that spread to more than 40 states. Freedom Road supports the Communist Party of China and the communist mass murderers Mao and Stalin.
This is Steph York. I'm the political secretary of Freedom Road Socialist Organization. Mao and Stalin were both Marxist-Leninists. That is how I identify as a Marxist-Leninist as well.
Within hours of Minneapolis outbreaks, Freedom Road Socialist Organization supporters staged often violent protests in Chicago, Milwaukee, New York, Dallas, Houston, Tallahassee, Jacksonville, Miami, Tampa, Salt Lake City, and Los Angeles. Allied pro-China communists spread protests to many other cities across the nation. When will the Communist Party of China's American supporters be brought to justice?
You can't tell me that Black Lives Matter hasn't had some impact around America.
Yes.
But who knows, it's a completely communist operation.
Founded by what, 2 or 3 communist women, right?
Yeah, 3. Patrice Cullors, Alicia Garza, and Opal Tometi.
Feminist and sexuality is even in question, right?
But 2 of them are lesbian, but at least 2 of them. But they are Marxist. They are all Marxists, and they're all affiliated with the Freedom Road Socialist Organization.
The coronavirus, which came from China, was deliberately spread by China, who are the people and it's China who's behind these riots in this country. So this is all part and parcel of destabilizing and demoralizing this country to the point of revolution.
Recently, our federal government and some of our border guys were able to confiscate a shipment that was reportedly coming in from China with gun parts, including silencers. You think any of that was meant for their Maoist Chinese communist street agitators? Silencers and semi-automatic weapons, etc., etc. You think any of that was meant for them, Trevor?
Absolutely. You know, Gordon Chang was on, a very, very good commentator was on TV the other night talking about this. The Chinese, that's why Trump closed down the Chinese consulate in Houston, because they have been materially aiding some of the radical elements on the streets in this country. You know, plus you have weapons being shipped over the border from Cuba and other countries. So yeah, the Chinese were caught in the 90s shipping automatic weapons to Los Angeles street gangs. So this has been going on for a long time. There's probably weapons caches all over this country just waiting to be dug up.
Not to mention the Islamic groups that have probably stashed weapons, and maybe even some of these mosques, as they found out a few years ago, they were going around closing down mosques in France, according to many public reports you can find, and they were going in there finding military-grade weaponry in those mosques over in France. So those folks might be involved as well in America, which is part of that red-green axis. In 1984, former KGB officer Yuri Bezmenov explained that much of the efforts of the communists has been and continues to be a disinformation or brainwashing campaign in order to turn Americans against their own national values, and thus to create chaos in the streets by which to collapse America from within.
Ideological subversion is the process which is legitimate, overt, and open. You can see it with your own eyes. All you have to do, all American mass media has to do, is to unplug their bananas from their ears, open up their eyes, and they can see it. There is no mystery. There is nothing to do with espionage. I know that espionage intelligence gathering looks more romantic. It sells more deodorants through the advertising, probably. That's why your Hollywood producers are so crazy about James Bond type of thrillers. But in reality, the main emphasis of the KGB is not in the area of intelligence at all. According to my opinion and opinion of many defectors of my caliber, only about 15% of time, money, and manpower is spent on espionage as such. The other 85% is a slow process which we call either ideological subversion or active measures, активные мероприятия in the language of the KGB, or psychological warfare. What it basically means is to change the perception of reality of every American to such an extent that despite of the abundance of information, no one is able to come to sensible conclusions in the interests of defending themselves, their families, their community, and their country. It's a great brainwashing process which goes very slow.
Consider the Black Lives Matter agenda. I warned about this in my documentary in 2018. Did you hear what I just said? I warned extensively about Black Lives Matter and Antifa in my 2018 documentary, Sabotage. Sadly, my friends, a July 2020 survey reported that 63% of Americans support the Black Lives Matter movement. Americans are turning against Americans. Americans are being trained and financially compensated by globalists and Marxist groups, both foreign and domestic, to take part in their goal of bringing down America.
Based in Boston and San Francisco and run by Maoist communists for more than 50 years, the Chinese Progressive Association is the Chinese Communist Party's main grassroots support group in the U.S. The Communist Party of China openly and covertly supports BLM.
The Chinese Foreign Ministry and the Communist Party's Global Times have been engaged in a malicious disinformation campaign, deliberately stoking racial tensions in the U.S., and U.S. Customs has seized items coming from China this year that would be very handy for protesters.
Americans are, in ever increasingly larger and larger numbers, being brainwashed to serve as useful idiots and dupes for the globalists, the Marxists, and the Islamists, and their desire to create chaos. Their desire is to create so much chaos that America will collapse from within. We've already learned that the Black Lives Matter organization was founded by Marxists, and yet countless American corporations now knowingly support financially an organization that admits on its very own website that it has the goal to, quote, disrupt the Western prescribed nuclear family structure, end quote. Historically in America, the family has been the incubator for passing on the values and principles that are necessary for continuing our constitutional republic. By overthrowing the nuclear family, they are indeed seeking to overthrow America as the longest-running constitutional republic in the history of the world. The Black Lives Matter website has stated their goal is to defund the police and divert that money to social programs for the redistribution of wealth and the furtherance of socialism. Clearly, many CEOs and their corporate boards have been brainwashed. They have been subjected to some or all of the 12 steps for brainwashing that include emotional manipulation, moral relativism, group consensus, revisionist history, intimidation, and rejection of reason, logic, and context. We cannot say we were not warned years ago as to the brainwashing tactics of the communists that sought to conquer America without firing a shot. In my last documentary, Siege, I played an audio of former Secretary of Agriculture Ezra Taft Benson describing what Soviet communist leader Nikita Khrushchev told him in a meeting. Benson told the story in order to warn Americans many years ago that the Soviets had a plan to brainwash Americans into accepting and embracing aspects of socialism under different names and programs, until they came to embrace the very philosophies of communism.
It may surprise you to learn that I was host to Mr. Khrushchev for a half day when he visited the United States. Not that I'm proud of it. I opposed his coming then, and I still feel it was a mistake to welcome this atheistic murderer as a state visitor. But according to President Eisenhower, Khrushchev had expressed a desire to learn something of American agriculture. And after seeing Russian agriculture, I can understand why. As we talked face to face, he indicated that my grandchildren would live under communism. After assuring him that I expected to do all in my power to assure that his and all other grandchildren will live under freedom, he arrogantly declared in substance, "You Americans are so gullible. No, you won't accept communism outright. But we'll keep feeding you small doses of socialism until you finally wake up and find you already have communism. We won't have to fight you. We'll so weaken your economy until you fall like overripe fruit into our hands." And they're ahead of schedule in their devilish scheme.
The communists have been very successful in America in accomplishing their goal of brainwashing Americans. One survey after another sadly reveals that indeed many Americans are willing to embrace socialism, the economic system of communism. Call it by such radical terms as social justice, critical race theory, white privilege, reparations, or the Black Lives Matter movement. It matters not. The result is the same. Many Americans have fallen over into the hands of the communists through a long brainwashing program that has been carried out through change agents and useful idiots with the power centers of education, media, religion, and government. One of the American POWs of the North Korean War, Edward Hunter learned the following. He writes, quote, "The Reds were able to break a man's mind only when they accomplished two things," he said. "They had to deprive him of clarity of thought and upset his sense of values," end quote. In our next broadcast, we will begin to break down the 12 steps of brainwashing and how to disrupt the disinformation warfare now engulfing America. In 1984, Yuri Bezmenov was asked what Americans could do to thwart the propaganda of the communists. His answer? Teach patriotism.
Okay, so what do we do? What is your recommendation to the American people?
Well, the immediate thing that comes to my mind is, of course, there must be a very strong national effort to educate people in the spirit of real patriotism, number one. Number two, to explain them the real danger of socialist, communist, whatever, welfare state, big brother government.
In his farewell address, President Ronald Reagan challenged Americans to pass on to their children an informed patriotism.
An informed patriotism is what we want. And are we doing a good enough job teaching our children what America is and what she represents in the long history of the world? Those of us who are over 35 or so years of age grew up in a different America. We were taught very directly what it means to be an American. And we absorbed almost in the air a love of country and an appreciation of its institutions. If you didn't get these things from your family, you got them from the neighborhood. From the father down the street who fought in Korea, or the family who lost someone at Anzio. Or you could get a sense of patriotism from school. And if all else failed, you could get a sense of patriotism from the popular culture. The movies celebrated democratic values and implicitly reinforced the idea that America was special. Younger parents aren't sure that an unambivalent appreciation of America is the right thing to teach modern children. And as for those who create the popular culture, well-grounded patriotism is no longer the style. We've got to do a better job of getting across that America is free. Freedom of speech, freedom of religion, freedom of enterprise, and freedom is special and rare. I'm warning of an eradication of the American memory that could result ultimately in an erosion of the American spirit. And so, goodbye. God bless you, and and God bless the United States of America.
In 1776, a group of good men decided to fight because they believed in liberty, freedom, individualism, prosperity based on hard work and honesty. They were committed to the ideals of private property, freedom of religion, freedom of speech, freedom from an oppressive and totalitarian government. On a warm July 4th, 1776, in the city of Philadelphia, 56 brave men signed their names to the Declaration of Independence. And it stated, quote, "With a firm reliance on the protection of divine providence, we mutually pledge to each other our lives, our fortunes, and our sacred honor," end quote. Many of these men were indeed men of means. They owned land, livestock, homes, businesses, and yet they risked it all for the one thing that money could not buy: liberty. Liberty and freedom had to be earned. It had to be fought for and won. And even though liberty could not be bought with money, liberty for America and these men came at a high price. One historical writer has written this, quote, "Of the 56, few were long to survive. 5 were captured by the British and tortured before they died. 12 had their homes from Rhode Island to Charleston sacked, looted, occupied by the enemy, or burned. 2 lost their sons in the army. 1 had 2 sons captured. 9 of the 56 died in the war from its hardships or from its bullets," end quote. Indeed, those brave and noble 56 men pledged and lost either their lives or the lives they had known. Their fortunes may have been destroyed, but their honor has remained intact to this very day. Will we continue the long, hard fight those 56 men began on our behalf in 1776? Or will we wait until there is no chance of victory, yet fight, because it's better to perish than to live as slaves? It has been said to be born free is a privilege. To die free is an awesome responsibility. Will you take responsibility for America, for liberty, and for freedom? One line of the Battle Hymn of the Republic reads, quote, "As he died to make man holy, let us live to make man free," end quote. Many in our nation's history have given their last full measure of devotion by laying down their lives as a sacrifice for freedom. Today, perhaps the greatest battle for America involves the battle for the mind. In 1958, before the Committee on Un-American Activities, Mr. Edward Hunter warned, quote, "I spent 30 years, a little bit more perhaps, in countries under various forms of communist pressure and attack. What I am witnessing in America is not different from what I saw in those countries," end quote. If Mr. Hunter saw communist brainwashing tactics being carried out in America in 1958, what would he say about what's happening in America today? As you will discover through this documovie, this battle for the mind of your children, grandchildren, friends, and fellow Americans can only be won by understanding the tactics of our national enemies that are both foreign and domestic. These are enemies that seek to capture the hearts and minds of Americans. Your interest in understanding this topic and being equipped to respond to the national crisis at hand is of great encouragement to me and all those involved in this production. Thank you for watching Part 1 of Brainwashed America.